Every month, France tries to assassinate Ibrahim Traoré. I swear to God, this man has been almost assassinated at least 10 times. Please pay attention, because they are trying to assassinate this man for a reason.
First, Franc say, you don't know how to manage your money. We're gonna demand that you deposit 85% of your bank reserves under the French Central Bank, under the control of the French Minister of Finance. Every year, year in, year out, because of these deposits from the African countries, France is taking out of Africa over $500 billion.
You need to start posting on what's going on in Burkina Faso, what's going on in Mali, what's going on in Niger, what's going on in Senegal. They're trying to assassinate Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso.
The French were getting Niger's uranium for 80 cents per kilogram, and the world market price is 200 euros per kilogram.
They already did it with Gaddafi. He tried to free Africa and they murder him. They unalive him. So if you got a phone, no matter where you are in the world, whether you're in Jamaica, whether you're in, no matter where you are, we need to start posting on what's going on in Burkina Faso.
Ibrahim Traoré is one of the most important leaders in Africa right now. Yet there has been 18 assassination attempts on his life. Now, many people put the blame on France, and rather than just me blaming the French, my goal in this video is to highlight why it is massively in the French and Macron's favor for Traoré to be assassinated. And then anyone that wants to connect the dots can connect the dots. This is very important, because when leaders get assassinated in Africa, the world doesn't pay attention. If we could take what Burkina Faso is doing as an example, Africa will not be poor for long. If you like the sound of that, stay tuned. For those of you that don't know, my name is TJ. I am Nigerian and British mixed. And recently I moved to Uganda to start a new life with my partner, Medina. And I started this channel basically to document my journey. What I found is, leaving the Western bubble, I'm faced with more issues around Pan-Africanism, global politics, and I'm interested in the betterment of Africa and society in general. So when I see a figure like Ibrahim Traoré, who has combined forces with Niger and Mali to create this new economic bloc, I watch closely, because over the years, I've just seen too many leaders sell out their people to enrich themselves. So before we get into the 18 assassinations and why assassinating Ibrahim Traoré benefits the French massively, let's just look at what he's done and what he's doing in his country and in his region.
When Captain Traoré first took office, he had a clear message: fix the security situation, boost the economy, and make Burkina Faso self-sufficient. One of his first, most striking moves was to cut ties with former colonial powers. Instead of relying on traditional Western alliances, he looked east and built relationships with countries like Russia, China, and Turkey. He made it clear Burkina Faso was taking control of its own future. No more dependency, no more begging for foreign aid.
Key, because right now, early 2025, there's a lot of controversy around what USA is doing with US aid, Doge, Elon Musk and Trump cutting the budget. And there's a lot of African countries crying about not having aid anymore. But I believe this is the proper attitude to have. How can we be self-sufficient? How can we provide our own aid?
One of Captain Traoré's most exciting initiatives is the creation of Faso Rail, a project that aims to connect every province of Burkina Faso through a national railway system. Instead of relying on foreign companies to provide trains and materials, everything is being manufactured in Burkina Faso. Captain Traoré is also committed to energy security, working with Russia's Atomic Corporation to build a nuclear plant that will provide clean, affordable energy for the country.
See, in the past, corporations would build those things of infrastructure, and then they would own those infrastructures on the ground and profit from them. So in this case, what you have is they're building their own. That doesn't mean foreigners are not coming and giving expertise. But this is where I'm talking about the education of Africa. Anyone that works on that project, even if a foreigner is overseeing it, in order to make sure it works to the high standards in the world. You get your professionals in, you get your contractors in, but that knowledge should stay in Africa, and the work should go to Africans. The employment should go to Africans. And this is what he's doing.
Burkina Faso, like many of its neighbors, has faced significant challenges in providing accessible healthcare. But under Captain Traoré's leadership, things are changing fast. One of his game-changing moves is the rollout of mobile health clinics that are bringing essential healthcare services to remote areas.
By the way, he's created 50, or he's committed to building 55 hospitals all over the country. And quite often what you find is leaders build one or two, or they build in their province of origin. But here you have him just building across the whole of his country.
Traoré is also working on Africa's largest pharmaceutical park, which will enable Burkina Faso to produce its own medicines. This is a huge step toward reducing dependence on foreign imports and making healthcare more affordable and accessible. Now let's dive into Burkina Faso's economic revolution. The country has long been one of Africa's top gold producers, but for years it has been exporting its gold raw without adding any value. Captain Traoré is changing that by building a domestic gold refinery. This means Burkina Faso will refine its own gold and sell it for a higher price, keeping more revenue within the country. Burkina Faso is also one of the largest producers of tomatoes in Africa. But instead of processing those tomatoes locally, the country has been importing tomato puree from Europe.
This is quite an important point. See, one of the things that I studied when I came to Uganda in terms of businesses I could do was things in agriculture. And I was made aware by some of my friends here that tomatoes go to waste in Africa. Many tomatoes go to waste. They produce many tomatoes. This is across many countries. And because of not being able to store them properly, because of not knowing how to do things like dehydrate them and make them into powder, which can store for months and years, the tomatoes just end up rotting and ending up on market floors or going to waste, even right on the farms. So the crazy thing about it is that there is more demand for tomato puree, tomato paste, and tomato products in Africa than Africa produces. So on the one hand, you have the massive waste of tomatoes, and on the other hand, you have massive demand. And these are the kinds of situations where Europe can take advantage, because what happens is those that are business savvy can export those tomatoes, process them, then African countries have to import these puree products that can last long life in tins and cans. Then they end up paying way over the price of what they produced, because the tomatoes end up going to Europe or going to Asia, then coming back to Africa. So this kind of move is very important for African countries to do. And here we are. Traoré is doing it.
Traoré isn't having it. He's launched a tomato processing plant that will add value to the country's tomato production, create jobs, and reduce reliance on imports. One of the biggest achievements has been the construction of Burkina Faso's largest hydroelectric dam. This dam will provide 24 million liters of water annually, boosting agricultural production and generating electricity for thousands of homes. His government has provided free tractors, subsidized seeds and fertilizers to farmers, boosting agricultural productivity and helping the country become more self-sufficient in food production. Over the last 2 years, food security in Burkina Faso has improved by 50%.
Can you imagine food security improving by 50% since Traoré's been in power? He's also building these infrastructure projects for electricity so that there is consistent power in the region. I think most people will agree many African countries do not have power consistency. These things that he's implementing here, hospitals, infrastructure, electricity, these are things that people simply take for granted in many Western countries, and many African countries have never had consistency around these basic needs that most people take for granted. So why would anyone want to assassinate a man that is doing all of these good things? Well, let's see what Dr. Arankana has to say about this.
One other thing that France did between 1958 and 1961 in the name of giving us our independence as African countries. France forced the Francophone, and I hate that terminology. There is no such thing as Francophone, Anglophone. They made it up. But for the purposes of communication, I will use that. 14 of those countries, they said, in order for you to get your independence from us, you must sign this document. You thought they could have found a better name for the document. The document was called the Pact. for the continuation, I repeat, the Pact for the continuation of colonization. We're talking about giving you independence, but sign this pact for the continuation of colonization in a different format. And I'm going to highlight some of those issues that they said you must agree to if you are going to be independent. Hello. Maybe we need to redefine the meaning of independence for the French. First, France say, you see, you don't know how to manage your money. We're going to demand that you deposit 85% of your bank reserves with the French Minister of Finance. Under the French Central Bank, under the control of the French Minister of Finance. France is then going to take your 85% bank deposits from each and every one of you. Deposit those funds in the French stock market under the French name. And you may or may not know the returns. Today, as we speak, the latest figures are saying for every 14 billion that France invests in the stock market from Africa, they are realizing upwards of 300 billion in return. Every year in, year out, because of these deposits from the African countries, France is taking out of Africa over $500 billion. Now figure it out. For every 14 billion, the returns on the investment are over 300 billion, and they are taking over 500 billion.
So I decided to do a little bit of research on this, and what she's saying is fundamentally true. However, the figures were a little off, but that doesn't change anything. There was an agreement signed up at the end of French colonization, which essentially is colonization in a new format, or neocolonialism. The agreement, often referred to as the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization, is related to the CFA Franc system, which involves 14 African nations depositing a significant portion of their foreign exchange reserves into the French treasury. This agreement is part of a broader set of historical agreements known as the Franc Afrique, which have been criticized for perpetuating neo-colonial control by France over its former colonies. So by the way, this is Perplexity AI. What it does is it goes and it researches sources before it gives you answers. It's very accurate in the things that it produces. It's not like ChatGPT, where sometimes it can make errors. This actually cites its sources. So you guys can go and do your own research on this. 50% reserve requirement. Under the agreement, these countries are required to deposit 50% of their foreign exchange reserves in French operations account. This requirement has been seen by many as a mechanism that limits economic sovereignty and independence, effectively binding these nations to France economic interests. This opens up a bigger can of worms around central banking. Central banking is a very nefarious thing, and every Western country is actually subject to central banking. What you don't realize is the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, and several banks across the world, they have private ownership. They are pseudo or non-governmental organizations, and they profit directly from the taxpayer with long-standing old agreements that were put into place by the banking classes of Europe many, many years ago. Those agreements, even in the West, are predatory. They require ever more debt to accumulate. You can see right now the US has 30 trillion in debt. The UK has, I don't know how many, I think 3 trillion in debt. So these countries are in debt because of the way in which they create money through the banking system. What France has done is create their own ownership of 14 African nations through their own banking system called the CFA Franc. They've learned from those that are manipulating them by doing it to African countries. This system accumulates debt, It accumulates debt by design, and it leaves these countries in terrible situations. And then they start going to the IMF, getting loans, which puts them further into debts they can never pay back. Then they create refinance agreements that put them ever into more and more debts. And using those finance agreements, they'll say, right, we want control of your resources in your country. And so the second point here at the bottom is resource exploitation. France is heavily involved in the extraction of resources in these countries, particularly uranium from Niger. So uranium is a very important element in nuclear power, and nuclear power is still majorly important all over the world. Energy drives everything on the planet, which constitutes a significant portion of France's energy supply. The exploitation is viewed by many as a continuation of colonial practices, etc., etc. If a country like Burkina Faso, which is teaming up with Mali and Niger, start figuring out how to be independent, by the way, they are working on their own currency to separate themselves from the CFA system. This now becomes a massive loss on the balance sheet of France, who are actually already struggling because of their own financial issues that are happening over there in Europe that has nothing to do with Africa. This is the kind of thing that would see a flipping, that would see the West start to decline, if not fully decline, from their position as generally wealthy countries to Africa becoming wealthy from the resources it produces itself.
The revolutionary government in Niger has just increased the price of uranium that it exports on the world market to 200 euros per kilogram. It was previously paying, or rather charging, 80 cents. The French were getting Niger's uranium for 80 cents per kilogram, and the world market price is 200 euros per kilogram, which is what little Macron will have to pay from now on. You see, it pays to stand up for your rights. That's what the people in Niger have done. It remains to be seen.
Traoré is the orchestrator of this situation. He's kicked out the French. He's created an alliance with the two neighboring countries, one of which produces massive amount of uranium, plus all of the rest of the resources, gold, etc., that the other countries produce as well. Remove them from their French banking and stop selling them resources that basically only give them less than 1% of the value that the French are able to sell for on the global market. Why wouldn't they want this guy dead? And it brings to light the symbolism of this image here. This is the national football team. Someone showed me a picture and said the French national football team is actually an African team. And I kind of waved this off in an isolated view. This is just the French national team, and migration has happened and they happen to have Africans on the team. But actually, the way I'm looking at it now is that it symbolizes how French is able to be successful. I'm not sure there's been a French team that's had less than 50% of their national team be of African descent from these countries that they exploit. We've seen it with Gaddafi. Gaddafi was putting together a group to separate Africa from the rest of the world's dollar-reliant banking system. The West doesn't like that. And then they started saying about all the terrible things Gaddafi has done, painting him to be a terrible dictator responsible for lots of murder, death, and pillaging. And then he's assassinated, even publicly assassinated. And the West cheers, this dictator's gone. But really what it's about is control of that region and control of the mindset of the leaders of Africa so that they will never rise up against the West. And so now the latest guy that is beloved, not just in his country, but all over Africa, everyone loves this guy because he's actually using money for the people rather than just to enrich himself. And we fear for his life. We fear for his life because there's already been 18 attempts on his life, almost one for every month he's been in power. And so I never really ask people to share my content. I believe if the video is good enough, people will share it automatically. setting aside how it would benefit my channel, this message is actually very important. Even if you don't share my video, if there's another video you like on Ibrahim Traoré, please share it, because people really need to understand what is going on in Africa. I'm on record talking about how Africa needs to take responsibility for itself, how they need to stop being corrupt, how they need to, stop just blaming the white man all the time, because I don't think that's very productive. But in this scenario, we have to do our best to ward off the powers that are trying to do things like assassinate our leaders, especially the leaders that are doing good for the continent. The West will have to come to the negotiating table with the proper respect. And God forbid, if Traoré is assassinated, this mindset, this message will continue, providing we do things like share, raise the awareness that this is what success looks like, and this is what should be strived for. You see, the everyday person on ground in Europe would also support this guy if they understood the message. It's the political class and the banking class that weave all these stories about terrible dictators in order to justify it when the people on ground in the West see these guys assassinated. And so they can celebrate, Gaddafi's dead, good, it liberates their people. But that's not the narrative on ground in Libya. We must take control, especially online, at the narrative of what's happening in Africa, so that they cannot manipulate and twist in order to gain leverage to do things like assassinate people. I'm sure you guys will have a lot of comments to talk about in this particular regard. But if you do not have a comment, would it be terrible of me to ask you to do one thing? Simply put, no assassination in the comment section. It lets me know that you support the channel, you like what I'm talking about, and you want me to continue. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.